They thought he was just a quiet old man who polished floors and whistled tunes too old for even the birds to remember. A man whose uniform was a janitor's jumpsuit, not the one they never imagined he once wore, whose hands shook not from fear, but from a kind of discipline etched into the bones over decades. One of the new medics at the base hospital, fresh out of school and full of talk, rolled her eyes as she closed the curtain around his hospice bed, whispering to no one in particular. Not every dusty old man with a limp is a legend. Elias Reed heard her, but said nothing. He never argued with the living. Instead, he let his eyes drift toward the top shelf above his bed, where a dented black thermos sat beside an old music box and a sealed envelope marked with faded red wax. Its seal unbroken since a different war, a different name, and a promise he never once spoke of. And then, the next morning, he didn't wake up. It was the night staff who found him, sitting upright, as if still on duty. It wasn't the silence that shook the nurse. It was what fell from his hand, a piece of sheet music, smudged with rainwater notes and worn fingerprints. They opened the envelope only because it had his name on it. Reed, Elias, Final Orders. And inside was a folded letter signed by General August Langston, head of Cold War Ghost Operations, along with 2 medals no one in the building had ever seen before. That's when everything changed. And if you believe that respect should never expire, and that some battles echo long after the last shot is fired, then like and subscribe now, because what happened next proves that memory, not metal, is what makes a man unforgettable. 3 weeks earlier, Elias Reed had still been sweeping the south hallway of Observation Post Echo, a fob-prone, wind-beaten outpost near the Lithuanian border where tension hummed under every satellite dish and every polished boot. Every morning at 0600, he'd shuffle in, mop handle balanced on his shoulder like a rifle, humming some forgotten minor key melody while younger soldiers yawned through their briefings and barely glanced at him. The nickname they gave him, Tunes, stuck not out of affection, but confusion. Tunes is probably the only one who thinks we're in a musical, someone joked. Elias would just keep humming, his steps even, slow, deliberate. But Lieutenant Reyes didn't like him. Not just in the casual way people ignore elders, but with the uneasy resentment of someone who senses they're being watched. Reyes was sharp, fast, tactical, and proud of it. So when Elias paused during a corridor sweep and said, "You've got a blind spot along Sector 6, Reyes snapped back, "What would you know about tactical blind spots, janitor?" and walked away. That same day, the Eastern Compound scheduled a private sniper exercise, classified, live drills, 2 clicks into the forest. Elias shouldn't have known. And yet that afternoon, as the wind picked up and the fog rolled in early, he was there, walking calmly with his thermos, near the edge of the woods, just outside the zone. When the spotters locked him in their scopes, something strange happened. Before they could relay confirmation or fire a warning flare, the man turned toward the tree line. Not looking at them, looking through them. And then he hummed. A 5-note sequence. The sniper flinched. Finger froze. Abort, someone whispered through the comms. He just gave the, "It's the Harrow stand down, sir." But no one had trained them in Harrow. No one had heard that melody in over 4 decades. It wasn't in any active manual. That tune, the one Elias Reed hummed every morning, the one they mocked in break rooms, was a ghost protocol from the Cold War. A stand-down signal encoded into music. And none of them knew why it worked on them. Or why one of the observers, a Soviet-born intelligence liaison named Grigory, had dropped his coffee and muttered, "Pale. The Whistler's not dead." Elias didn't stay long. He walked back the way he came, nodding politely to an oncoming sergeant who noticed the wind around him had gone still. That night, Reyes submitted a formal complaint about unauthorized personnel near classified drills. In response, all he got was a handwritten note on his desk. 5 words. Watch the trees at dawn. And the music box on his desk? The one that hadn't been there the day before? It played that same 5-note melody. Slowly. Hollow. Like a warning wrapped in a lullaby. None of them knew what Elias Reed had done. But by the time the blackout hit, by the time the radar went dead and foreign silhouettes appeared along the ridge in perfect sniper formation, it was too late to ask. Elias was already gone. And what came next? Let's just say it wasn't bullets that stopped the breach. It was a melody they couldn't trace. A harmony no enemy could stand to hear. And the ghost of a man they thought was just a janitor, whose legacy would soon rattle the Pentagon doors. They didn't issue a formal report, not at first, because no one knew how to write one that included music box-activated Cold War stand-down protocol, without sounding like a conspiracy blog or hallucination. So instead, the base went quiet. Tight-lipped, embarrassed by the way a forgotten janitor with a limp and a humming habit had managed to rattle a room full of high-clearance operators and spook a Soviet liaison into silence. And while command debated the optics of it all, something even stranger began to unfold. Soldiers started finding copies of the melody, 5 notes, always the same sequence, scribbled on the backs of cafeteria napkins, drawn into the corners of whiteboards, etched into supply crates as if the compound itself was remembering something no one wanted to admit. And Reyes, now shaken enough to dig deeper, pulled Elias Reed's file again, only to discover that it had been locked, sealed by Department of Ghost Operations. Directive 117H, clearance restricted, which didn't exist in any public record. Meanwhile, in the woods beyond the base, surveillance drones picked up something peculiar. No footprints, no heat signatures, but a strange cluster of leaves that had shifted overnight into a 5-point spiral visible only from above, perfectly aligned with the radio tower behind the barracks. And when questioned, the tech team shrugged and said they assumed it was wind. Though Reyes knew better, because the day Elias Reed walked past the radar hub and tapped it twice, he'd said under his breath, "Still tuned too loud, it'll attract echoes," and no one had thought to ask what he meant, just like they hadn't noticed that the melody he always hummed had a tempo exactly 68 beats per minute. The same tempo used in Operation Harrow's friendly recognition loop, a classified auditory key used to identify Allied operatives under deep fog or blackout conditions. Back in the common room, someone found an old field manual buried behind a stack of board games. Its leather binding worn, its pages brittle, and inside, a line that made Reyes stop breathing. "If sound fails and vision breaks, the whisperer shall walk and memory will hold the perimeter," a protocol tag attributed to Commander ER. With no further details, and when Reyes cross-referenced the initials with Cold War records, a single match flickered onto his screen before the page blinked red and access was denied. The same night, the outpost experienced its first full blackout. No storm, no warning, just silence and static, as the power grid collapsed for 13 minutes straight, during which 3 breach alerts triggered simultaneously on sectors previously marked as low threat. And when soldiers rushed to respond, they found nothing but a folded music sheet tucked into the security console, with a handwritten note at the bottom: "Wrong key, wrong time, right man," and next to it, Elias's old thermos, still worn. Panic set in at the Pentagon when satellite uplinks showed unknown heat signatures approaching NATO's eastern corridor, and all communications jammed with a single repeating frequency, 5 tones, soft, minor key, identical to Elias's tune, which one of the analysts identified as Code Harrow, pulse variant. Something supposedly decommissioned in 1983 after being deemed too psychologically destabilizing for hostile units because it didn't just confuse the enemy, it made them stop, not from fear, but from something older. Something their bodies recognized even, if their minds couldn't. Like a lullaby played during chaos. General Langston, now retired and mostly invisible in D.C., received the alert on an encrypted line and went deathly still. His aide later said, before murmuring, he warned them, told them not to discard the melody, and by dawn, the base was swarming with suits, defense auditors, internal affairs, and one silent woman in black named Harper who never gave a title but asked only one question to every soldier: "Where did the melody come from?" And the few who tried to answer all described the same impossible thing, that it didn't feel like music, it felt like memory walking into the room. The snipers, especially, couldn't explain it. They said when the 5 notes echoed, they saw something else. A flash of forest, the scent of ash and wet stone, and a name they'd never learned, the Whistler, and yet all of them swore they heard someone whisper behind them just before they froze. When Harper reviewed the footage from the blacked out night, she found no visual confirmation of breach, but the audio, carefully reconstructed, contained a faint harmonic signal embedded beneath the static, and when run through the old Harrow cipher algorithm, it produced a sequence of coordinates pointing to a forgotten bunker beneath the outpost, sealed since the Cold War, one no one had touched in 40 years. Inside, they found a chair, a cassette player, and a dusty plaque that read, "If this melody plays, the shadows have returned, be still. And remember who listened first," and next to it, a journal filled with decades of surveillance logs, handwritten in Elias Reed's looping script, covering threats that had never been publicly recorded. As if the man had continued defending the base long after anyone asked him to, silently, daily, with nothing but eyes, ears, and that haunting tune, Reyes stood in the dark, reading the last page over and over. It's not the gun that holds the line. It's the silence after the last note, and only. Then did he realize Elias Reed hadn't been humming for comfort. He'd been sending warnings the only way he could, to anyone willing to listen, and they hadn't, not until the music played too loud to ignore, and by then, the ghosts had already crossed the fence. They tried to hold a briefing the next morning, tried to explain away the harmonic breach, the phantom coordinates, the bunker beneath their feet that hadn't existed on any updated schematics. But the problem wasn't in the data, it was in the silence, because no one wanted to say the thing that was now obvious to everyone in that room. Elias Reed had been watching the perimeter longer than anyone else alive, and he had done it without a desk, without rank, without a single protocol to hide behind. Just rhythm, instinct, and the kind of memory that doesn't ask for credit, only attention. And now, that memory was unraveling through every corridor. Reyes sat alone in the surveillance lab, eyes locked on the final frame from the audio reconstruction. A frequency map rendered in ghostly waves, 5 tones humming through the air like a lullaby stretched across decades, and underneath it, the caption that had auto-populated from the decryption tool. Echo return pattern stable. Operator confirmed. E. Reed. Active. But Reed was dead, wasn't he? The hospital had declared it. Body bag zipped. Yet the pattern timestamp was from 4 hours ago. Reyes ran a second trace, then a third. Each one pinged the same. Sector Delta, southeast tree line, perimeter echo at 68 BPM, which meant either the system was broken, or Elias Reed had never truly left the post. By nightfall, everyone had heard the story, that a man with no clearance had uncovered a harmonic blind spot before it was weaponized, that the haunting melody wasn't folklore, but a warning from the last generation of soldiers trained to see through sound, and that the janitor had led a program so classified it was buried beneath an Intel firewall with a 99-year lockout. But none of that mattered when the power failed again, not from inside, but from a targeted surge outside the fence line. Just as a blizzard swept through the forest, and every feed went dark. Reyes didn't wait for permission. He grabbed his coat, a flare gun, and the battered music box left on his desk, then walked straight into the woods, toward the same culvert Elias had checked every week for 12 years. Snow fell like ash. Wind shrieked through the pines. But when Reyes reached the clearing, the wind died, and the melody began. Not from the box, from somewhere deeper. 5 notes, faint and mournful, echoed from the mist, and as the fog parted, Reyes saw them. 6 figures, thermal gear, scoped rifles, too still, too precise to be lost hikers, and at their center stood a man who looked wrong in all the right ways. Posture too calm, boots too polished, his face obscured by a hood, until the stranger reached up, removed his glove, and tapped 2 fingers against the side of his neck, the universal signal for hero clearance. Reyes lowered the flare. Slowly. Identify, he whispered. The man tilted his head, and for the briefest second, Reyes thought he saw him. Elias, not alive, not a ghost, but something in between, like a memory worn into a man's movements. But the man didn't speak. He just pressed play on a cassette recorder pulled from his chest rig, and the melody filled the trees again. Every figure froze, weapons dropping slightly, and then melted back into the forest without a word, like actors in a performance they didn't want to disrupt. Reyes returned to base before dawn. No injuries, no breach, no footprints left behind. Just the music box in his hand, still humming, and one final note etched into the lid. You remembered the rhythm. That morning, the general flew in. Not for security, not for containment, but for a naming ceremony. Without press, without flags. Just a plaque placed beneath the old radar tower that read, Reed Station, Perimeter Memory Operative, 1969 to 2024. Defender in silence. Soldiers didn't salute as much as they paused when they passed it, like a moment of collective recognition that they'd missed something vital before and weren't about to miss it again. Reyes took over Elias's old route, not out of duty, but out of gratitude. Every morning, before sunrise, he walked the fence line, checked the latches, watched the wind. He never hummed, But he played the melody once, on cassette, just loud enough for the trees to hear. And sometimes, when the fog was thickest and the woods too quiet, the wind answered back, not in words, not in fret, but in echo, like something ancient still listening from the treeling. Elias Reed had never asked to be seen, never tried to prove himself, never raised his voice. He just made sure the melody kept playing. And long after his name left the duty logs, long after his story became whispered doctrine to new recruits, the music box still sat in the command booth, beside a folded uniform and a journal no one dared open, because some songs aren't for explaining. They're for remembering. And some men don't leave behind instructions. They leave behind a rhythm. And if you stand still long enough, you'll hear it. 5 notes, slow and steady. Just enough to keep the shadows out. Just enough to remind you someone was always listening.